The best-selling and most successful female album released in 1960 was Etta James' At Last, that has sold 10 million copies up to date. Biggest female album released in 1961 was country legend Patsy Cline's Showcase, that sold 10 million units up to date. 1962 was a slower year for women in music, but the biggest album was Judy Garland, A Garland Touch. This was her last studio album and has sold around 2 million copies. 1963 was also a slower year, yet biggest female album released in 1963 was Barbra Streisand's second studio album, sold around 2 million copies. Best-selling female album released in 1964 was Where Did Our Love Go by The Supremes, that has sold 5 million copies in that year alone. 1965 was again ruled by The Supremes, an album titled More Hits by The Supremes, that sold around 4 million copies. 1966 belongs again to The Supremes and their album The Supremes A Go-Go, that has sold over 3.5 million copies. 1967 belongs to Barbra Streisand and her Christmas album, that has sold 5 million copies in the US alone. Biggest female album released in 1968 is Aretha Franklin's album Aretha Now, sold around 1 million. 1969 belongs to Dusty Springfield and her brilliant Dusty in Memphis album, that has sold over 1 million in the first year of its release. Biggest female album released in 1970 was Diana Ross's first solo album, Diana, that has sold 8 million copies. 1971 belongs to Carole King and her colossal success of Tapestry. The album has sold over 25 million copies. Biggest female album released in 1972 is No Secrets by Carly Simon. The album has sold over 7 million copies. 1973 belongs to Karen Carpenter and the duo Carpenters, with a compilation album of hits for the first 4 years of their career, with sellings over 20 million copies. Best-selling album in 1974 was Barbra Streisand's The Way We Were, that has sold over 4 million copies. Biggest female album of 1975 was Have You Never Been Mellow by Olivia Newton-John, that has sold 5 million units. 1976 was again the year of Barbra Streisand, with A Star Is Born and sales of 8 million copies. Biggest female album released in 1977 was Linda Ronstadt's Simple Dreams, with sales of 8 million copies. 1978 belongs to Blondie with their iconic Parallel Lines and sales over 20 million copies. 1979 is the year of Queen of Disco Donna Summer, whose album Bad Girls has sold over 10 million copies. 1980, the first year of the new decade, and again Streisand with her biggest album in her career, Guilty, that has sold over 20 million copies. Biggest female album released in 1981 was Physical by Olivia Newton-John, that has sold over 10 million copies. 1982 was a slower year for the 80s. Dionne Warwick and her Heartbreaker has sold over 3 million copies. 1983 was a bang for Cyndi Lauper and her album She Is So Unusual, that has sold over 20 million copies. Biggest female album released in 1984 was Tina Turner's comeback album Private Dancer, with sales over 20 million copies. 1985 was the year of Whitney Houston with her eponymous debut album, with sales of 30 million copies worldwide. Best-selling female album released in 1986 was Madonna's True Blue, with sales over 25 million copies. Biggest female album released in 1987 was Whitney, the second album of Whitney Houston, with sales over 22 million. Tracy Chapman owned 1988 with her brilliant eponymous album with sales of 20 million. Biggest female album released in 1989 is Madonna's Like a Prayer, with sales of 16 million copies. 1990 was again Madonna's year with her compilation album The Immaculate Collection, with sales over 30 million copies. Biggest female album released in 1991 was Shepherd Moons by Enya. Album has sold over 13 million copies. Whitney Houston owned 1992 with the colossal success of The Bodyguard that has sold over 45 million copies. Best-selling female album released in 1993 was Mariah Carey's Music Box, with sales over 31 million copies. 1994 is again Mariah's year with her Christmas classic Merry Christmas, with sales over 15 million copies. 1995 belongs to Alanis Morissette and her masterpiece Jagged Little Pill. The album is sold over 33 million copies. Biggest album released in 1996 is Celine Dion's Falling Into You, with massive sales over 32 million copies. 1997 is the year of Shania Twain and her colossal Come On Over that has sold over 40 million copies, making it the best-selling female studio album. Best-selling female album of 1998 is The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill by Lauryn Hill, with sales of 19 million copies. 1999 belongs to Britney Spears and her debut album Baby One More Time, with sales over 30 million copies. Biggest female album released in 2000 is Britney Spears and Oops, I Did It Again, with sales between 20 and 25 million copies. 2001 is the year of Shakira and her Laundry Service. The album has sold over 20 million copies. Best-selling female album released in 2002 is Come Away With Me by Norah Jones. The album has sold over 27 million copies. 2003 is the year of Beyoncé with her debut album Dangerously in Love, with sales over 14 million copies. Biggest female album released in 2004 is Breakaway by Kelly Clarkson. The album has sold over 13 million copies. Best-selling female albums released in 2005 are two albums actually, Madonna's Confessions on a Dance Floor and Mariah's The Emancipation of Mimi, both of them with sales over 12 million copies. 2006 is the year of Amy Winehouse with her album Back to Black, with sales over 20 million copies. 2007 belongs to Rihanna and her album Good Girl Gone Bad. The album has sold over 9 million copies. Biggest female album released in 2008 is The Fame by Lady Gaga. The album has sold over 15 million copies. Best-selling female album released in 2009 is Susan Boyle's I Dreamed a Dream, with sales over 9 million. 2010 belongs to Katy Perry and Teenage Dream. The album has sold over 7 million copies. Adele owned 2011 with colossal success of her album 21. The album has sold over 35 million copies. Biggest female album released in 2012 is Red by Taylor Swift, that has sold over 7 million copies. Best-selling female albums released in 2013 are two albums actually, Katy Perry Prism and Beyoncé's eponymous album, both of them with sales over 5 million. In 2014, biggest female album released is 1989 by Taylor Swift. The album has sold over 11 million copies. Biggest female album released in 2015 is 25 by Adele. To date, 25 has sold over 22 million copies. Best-selling female albums released in 2016 are two albums again, Anti by Rihanna and Lemonade by Beyoncé. Both of them have sales over 3 million. 2017 is again the year of Taylor Swift and her album Reputation, with sales over 4.5 million copies. Biggest female album released in 2018 is Lady Gaga's soundtrack for A Star Is Born, with sales over 6 million copies. 2019 is Guess Who, again Taylor Swift, with her album Lover, with sales over 5 million copies. 2020 is in the early stages now, yet only female #1 album is Selena Gomez with Rare. Sources for this list are Billboard, Nielsen SoundScan, Recording Industry Association of America, published certifications, and magazines such as Times, Rolling Stone, and others.
If you like this video, be sure to subscribe, follow me on my Instagram account, and support our channel by becoming a patron on Patreon, and with a bunch of rewards help us creating together a great content with your favorite artists. Bye!